The sticky rice on a restaurant plate tonight, the warm pearly grain that holds its shape between chopsticks, is chemically almost the same substance that holds parts of the Great Wall of China together. Ming-era masons cooked sticky rice into a thin pale soup and stirred it into their lime mortar. The starch inside, called amylopectin, slows the growth of the lime crystals as they set. The joints become harder, smoother, and far more water-resistant than ordinary mortar. 5 centuries later, those joints are still holding, a quiet place to fall asleep and to wake up knowing one small thing you didn't know before. So settle into wherever you are tonight. Let your shoulders ease away from your ears. Let the day slip a little further behind you. Soften your jaw, lengthen your breath, and let the room around you grow a little quieter than it was a moment ago. Tonight we walk a single stretch of stone wall on the northern frontier of late Ming China. Watchtowers spaced like beads along a ridge, lamplight inside cold brick, smoke drifting at dusk, and a code written in those columns of smoke that we will learn together before the night is done. We begin where the brick begins, not at the wall itself, but at a kiln on a low ridge, a few hours' walk from the line of stone we will spend the night with. The kiln is a fat, squat dome of fired clay, breathing slow grey smoke into a sky the colour of pale tea. Around it, stacks of fresh bricks dry in the sun. A boy turns one of them carefully, the way a baker turns bread. The brick is heavy. It is the size and the weight of a small dog. It is warm on one side from the morning sun, cool on the other from the shadow. When the brick is finally done, when the kiln master has decided it is hard enough, it does not yet leave the yard. Before it goes anywhere, before it climbs the slope on the back of a man or a mule, it is stamped. A wooden block is pressed into the soft underside. The mark left there records, in small clear characters, the weight of this brick, the kiln it came from, and the name of the foreman whose team made it. Imagine for a moment that you are looking at this same brick on the side of a mountain 500 years from now. The cold has weathered its face. Rain has run down it 10,000 times. Lichen has tried and failed to climb its joints. But if you set your hand to the underside, the side that faces the inside of the wall, away from the world, you can still feel the shape of those small characters, a name, a kiln, a weight, a signature pressed into clay before you were born, before your grandparents were born, before the country you live in had a name. This was not an accident. This was a system. The Ming Wall was not built by anonymous hands. It was built by named hands, by a long chain of named hands. Above the bricklayers stood the masons. Above the masons stood the carpenters and stonecutters. Above all of them stood foremen, whose work was checked by inspectors, whose ledgers were checked by clerks, whose clerks reported back to garrison commanders. A brick that cracked too easily could be traced. The kiln that fired it could be named. The foreman who shaped it could be called in. And quietly, somewhere in a stone archive at a place called Ju Yongguan Pass, a clerk wrote it all down. If you have ever bought something in a modern shop and noticed a small stamp on the underside, a factory code, a batch number, a quiet mark that no one is really meant to read. You have already met the same idea. The Ming brickmakers got there 400 years ahead of the factories. Picture the brick again, on its way up the slope. A mule plods along a path worn smooth by other mules. A man walks beside it with a switch. He is not in a hurry. The slope is steep and the sun is high. The brick on the mule's back is sweating faintly, the way clay sweats when it is still drying. Below them, the village. Above them, the line of the wall, half built, the new section paler than the older one beside it. A foreman waits at the top with a wax tablet and a brush. The brick arrives. The foreman checks the stamp. He notes the weight. He notes the kiln. He notes his own name beside the team that delivered it. Then he waves the mule through. At the wall, the bricklayer is already waiting. He has a trowel, a wooden float, a small cup of water beside him. The mortar is in a wooden tub at his feet. A strange, faintly sweet-smelling paste, white and pale grey, of which we will say more in a little while. He scoops a handful onto the previous brick. He smooths it flat. He sets the new brick down, taps it twice with the heel of his hand, and slides it tight against its neighbor. Done. The brick is now invisible. It is one of millions. To anyone looking at the wall from below, it has simply become the wall. It has lost its stamp to the inside of the structure forever, or so it seems. 500 years later, in a place called Jiankou, a steep, half-ruined section a few hours north of Beijing, careful restorers began to lift bricks out of the rubble where the wall had collapsed, and on their undersides, on the faces that had once been turned in toward the wall's hidden interior, they began to find the stamps, the kiln names, the dates, the weights, the chain of small clerks and foremen who had once been responsible for this one brick, suddenly returned to the daylight, blinking. One of those bricks carried something the system had not asked for. Not a kiln mark, not a weight, just a line scratched into the surface by a nail or a hard stone, by a worker who had stopped for a moment while no one was looking. Translated loosely, it reads, "No wine, no rest. 3 years of hard labor have turned my hair white." You can hold that line in your mind for a moment. He could have said anything. He chose to say that. The wall is full of these quiet records. At Juyongguan, the names of supply teams, the kiln workshops, the stone pond depots, the carpenters' yards, are recorded on stone tablets so that any later inspector could follow the chain of custody for any load of stone or brick. The wall, in this sense, was not only a defensive structure, it was also a vast, slow piece of paperwork, written in clay and stone and ink, distributed across 1,000 miles of mountain. It is easy, looking at a wall like this, to think of it as one thing, a line on a map, a monument, a picture on a postcard. It helps sometimes to remember that it is the sum of millions of small acts. A stamp pressed into clay, a foreman's brush ticking a column, a mule's slow walk up a slope, a line scratched by a tired man, and the wall you are picturing, by the way, the high stone snake along the ridges with its square towers and its crenellated walks, is not in fact as ancient as you might think. It is mostly the Ming overlay. It is only 400 to 600 years old. Underneath it, in many places, lies an older wall, a long line of packed earth, raised dynasties earlier, weathered down into low ridges that look, from a distance, like a natural fold in the land. The Ming masons built on top of it, in stone and brick, because stone and brick would last longer than earth. So the wall in your mind is a wall on top of a wall, a new memory laid over an older one. Tonight, when we walk along its top, when we lean inside a tower, or pass a market gate, or climb a flight of weathered stone steps, remember that you are walking on a structure whose every component once had a name. Every brick was someone's careful day. Every joint was someone's quiet trowel. Every stamp was someone's small act of being counted. The sun is moving now. The kiln yard has gone quiet. The last of the day's mules has gone up the slope. A foreman is closing his wax tablet, tying his brush back into its cloth. Down at the wall, the bricklayer rinses his hands in the bucket and watches the light go pale on the freshly placed bricks. The newest part of the wall, the part finished only today, is still the wrong color, too clean, too pale, too obviously made by hands. In a year the weather will soften it. In 10 years you will not see the seam. In a century it will simply be the wall. The system of named hands extended a long way down. The kiln master who fired the bricks was himself overseen by a kiln supervisor who answered to a regional inspector who reported in his turn to the Office of Works for the garrison district. Every link in that chain produced paperwork. When restorers in our century opened the stone archive at Juyongguan Pass, they found stacks of these reports, folded sheets of coarse rice paper, the ink faded but legible, listing kilns by name, foreman by name, and the dates on which a given run of bricks had passed inspection. Each report carried a small red seal at the foot. The seal said, very simply, that the run had been approved. In some places along the wall, on stone tablets set into the masonry beside a gate or a tower, the names of entire supply teams have been carved into the stone itself. A list of kiln workshops, a list of quarry pits, a list of carpenters' yards. The tablets were set into the wall the way a building today might carry a small bronze plaque listing the architect and the year of completion, and for the same reason, so that anyone walking past, generations later, could see who had been responsible. The wall was not modest about its makers. It was, in its quiet way, proud of them. Picture for a moment what a day inside the chain of custody actually looked like. A foreman walks the line of fresh bricks in his yard at first light. He checks for cracks. He turns a few over and looks at the stamps on the undersides. He notes any that have come out poorly, sets them aside for the kiln master to redo, and counts the rest. He writes the count into a small bound book whose cover is stained from years of being carried in a coat pocket. Halfway through the morning, the regional inspector arrives on a small dusty horse. He sits down beside the foreman, drinks a cup of bitter tea, and reads the book. He signs his initials at the bottom of the page. He rides on to the next yard. By the time those bricks reach the wall, the page in the foreman's small bound book has been signed twice. By the time the wall is finished, somewhere in a regional archive, a clerk has copied the foreman's page into a master ledger, and the master ledger has been carried once a year to a deeper archive in the capital. None of this is dramatic. None of it is heroic. It is the slow paperwork of a state that wanted very seriously to know who had made what. Many of the men doing the work were not bricklayers by trade. They were conscripts. They had been assigned to the wall by lot, in the way that a man might be assigned to a year of compulsory service in a modern country. Some of them had walked weeks to get there from villages they would not see again for 3 years. Some were soldiers detailed from their garrisons to help in the building season. Some were skilled men, sons of bricklayers and sons of bricklayers' sons, who had grown up knowing the smell of the kiln and the weight of a trowel in the hand. The work was hard. The pay was thin. The food was millet and pickled cabbage and, on a lucky evening, a small piece of pork fat from a shared iron pan. That hand-scratched line on the underside of the G&Co brick, the line about no wine, no rest, 3 years of hard labor, was not a complaint to anyone in particular. It was a small private record, made because a man had a moment alone with a brick and felt the weight of the time he had spent. He was probably one of those conscripts. He was probably hungry. He was probably tired. He set the line into the clay and put the brick into the wall, and went back to his row, and we did not meet him again. And so as the brick settled into place beside its neighbor, the wall began to remember another kind of fact, the recipe that was holding it all together. The pale gray paste in the wooden tub, the strange sweet smell of cooking grain near the kiln, the reason this wall of all walls was going to last. Beside almost every long stretch of Ming wall, you would have found a kiln, and beside almost every kiln, you would have found a pot, not a small pot, a wide iron pot, set into a brick stove, big enough for 2 men to stir at once, with long wooden paddles. Inside it, slow bubbling, a pale soup. The smell, if you came close, was familiar and strange at the same time. It was the smell of rice. It was the smell of dinner. But beside a stone wall on a frontier ridge, far from any village kitchen, the smell was disorienting. The men stirring the pot did not eat what was in it. They were making mortar. For centuries this was an open secret. The masons knew, the foremen knew, the kiln masters knew, but it was not the kind of thing anyone wrote a treatise about. It was simply how you mixed mortar if you wanted it to hold. You took your slaked lime, burnt limestone, slaked with water until it became a soft white paste, and you stirred in a hot soup of cooked sticky rice. You let it cool. You troweled it between your bricks. You moved on. The wall held. That was the proof. For a long time, no one outside China gave this much thought. The wall stood. People assumed it stood because it had been built thickly enough, or because the climate was dry enough, or because someone had been very careful. Then, in the early years of this century, A chemist at Zhejiang University named Bingjian Zhang got curious about the pale gray paste in the joints of old Ming buildings. He scraped a little out. He took it back to a laboratory. He looked at it under a scanning electron microscope, and what he saw on the screen was a slow, quiet revolution. In ordinary lime mortar, calcium carbonate forms large, somewhat brittle crystals as the mortar sets. The crystals are strong, but they leave small gaps between them where water can creep in. Over centuries, water freezes in those gaps, expands, and slowly fractures the mortar from inside. The wall comes apart, one winter at a time. In Zhang's Ming sample, the crystals were different. They were smaller, more numerous, more tightly packed. Threaded between them was something the calcium carbonate crystals had not been alone with: long branching molecules of amylopectin, the starch in sticky rice. The amylopectin had wrapped itself around the growing crystals as they formed and quietly told them, in the language of chemistry, to stop growing so large. The result was a mortar that was smoother on the inside, denser, and far more resistant to water working its way in. This is a kind of material a chemist today would call an organic-inorganic composite. The phrase sounds modern. The substance is not. It was being mixed in iron pots beside the wall 400 years before anyone used the word composite in English. There is one more small fact about sticky rice that deserves a quiet pause. The reason sticky rice is sticky, the reason it clumps the way ordinary long-grain rice does not, is a single genetic mutation in the rice plant. Most rice plants produce two kinds of starch. There is amylose, which is straight and dissolves easily, and there is amylopectin, which is heavily branched and sticks. In sticky rice, the gene that should make amylose is broken. The plant produces almost nothing but amylopectin. The grain is, in chemical terms, almost pure stickiness. Somewhere in the history of agriculture, someone noticed this and selected for it. Someone wanted the rice that clumped. Someone planted it again the next year, and then someone much later, in the kitchen of a Chinese cook, noticed that the water you poured off after cooking sticky rice was thick, almost gluey, and would dry hard on the inside of a pot. From cooking, the trick walked over to building. From building, it walked onto the wall. Picture the pot again now. The fire underneath is low. A boy is feeding it small split sticks. The two men at the paddle are turning the soup slowly, the way you might stir porridge. The soup is the color of warm cream. Steam rises in slow curling columns into a sky going the pale orange of a late afternoon kiln. From the kiln behind them comes the heavier, mineral smell of fired stone. When the soup is ready, it is ladled into a wide wooden tub of slaked lime. The mixture is stirred until it is the right thickness, about that of warm batter, the masons would say if a foreman asked. Then it is covered with a sheet of damp cloth and carried up the slope on a yoke across a man's shoulders. At the wall, the bricklayer waits. He has seen the steam coming up the path. He knows the mortar is on its way. When the tub arrives at his feet, he uncovers it and looks in. He stirs once with his trowel to check. Satisfied, he scoops a little out and begins. The mortar goes on cool. It smells faintly sweet for a few minutes, then loses the smell as it begins to set. The bricklayer slides a brick into it. He taps. He moves on. The joint between this brick and the next is, in chemistry that no one in this century yet has a name for, beginning to become something extraordinary. There is also a small, almost domestic side effect of this mortar that few people stop to notice. Sticky rice mortar, once cured, is hostile to roots. Weeds and small woody plants do not like to live in it. On many a long old wall, where lime mortar would have softened into a thin soil and let grasses and saplings take hold, the Ming wall stayed bare in its joints, year after year, century after century. The wall was, in a quiet way, gardening against itself. The sun is lower now. The kiln yard is winding down. The two men at the pot have taken the paddles out and laid them across the rim. The boy has stopped feeding the fire. The smell of cooked rice still hangs in the air, mixed with the cooler smell of stone. Below them, the wall is going dark at the base, while the top is still catching light. A foreman is walking the freshly mortared section, dragging a fingertip lightly across a joint to check for stickiness. His finger comes away clean. The mortar has set. He nods to no one in particular and turns back toward the village. It would be a long time before anyone outside this kiln yard understood what had just happened in the joints of those bricks. The men did not need to understand. They only needed to know that this was how you mixed mortar, here, on this wall. The recipe had come down to them from their fathers, and from their fathers' fathers, and that was enough. Beside the iron pot and the wooden tub stood the kiln itself, and the kiln was a small world of its own. It was tended by a kiln master and 3 assistants who worked it on a rotating schedule that lasted, when a kiln was firing, for several days at a stretch. The kiln master watched the color of the flame through a small slit in the wall. He could tell from the shade of orange whether the heat inside was where it should be. If the color drifted toward yellow, he ordered more wood. If it drifted toward red, he eased back. The work was patient, and it was also expert. A kiln master who could not read his fire wasted a whole load of bricks. The wood for the kiln came down from the slopes above the village, cut and stacked through the autumn by men who had no other connection to the wall and would never set foot on it. The lime came from a limestone quarry farther up the valley, where another team of men with hammers and chisels broke the white stone into pieces the size of a fist and loaded them onto the same kind of mule carts we have already seen on the slope. The rice came from much farther away. The northern frontier did not grow much sticky rice. The rice had to be carried up from the south, sometimes hundreds of miles, in sacks that looked very much like the sacks of millet a merchant might carry to a garrison gate. By the time a bag of sticky rice arrived at a kiln yard on the wall, it had already passed through several hands. The pot on the stove represented, in that sense, a long thin line that stretched from a rice paddy in a warmer river valley all the way to this cold ridge under a pale orange sky. The pot was an act of logistics as much as it was an act of chemistry. Without the cart of rice, there was no pot. Without the pot, there was no mortar. Without the mortar, there was no joint that would hold for 500 years. The bricklayer at the wall does not think of all this. He does not need to. He thinks, as he scoops the pale grey paste with his trowel, that today the mortar is the right thickness. He thinks the joints he is laying down today are going to be good ones. He thinks briefly of the small bowl of millet porridge waiting for him in the village when his shift is over. He sets a brick. He taps. He moves on. Up the slope, behind him, the kiln master is reading his fire one more time before the long evening shift. The orange in the small slit is right. The bricks inside the kiln are slowly becoming the bricks of the wall. By dawn, when the kiln cools enough to open, a new stack will come out, ready to be stamped by the foreman in the yard and carried by mule up the slope to the bricklayer with the wooden trowel. The cycle is patient. The wall grows brick by brick, joint by joint, day by day. There is one more thing to say about the recipe before we leave the kiln yard. The Ming masons were not the first to think of mixing organic material into mortar. Builders in different parts of China had been experimenting with the idea for centuries before the Ming Wall went up. Sometimes the additive was egg white in fancy palace work. Sometimes it was the pulpy juice from boiled mulberry bark, which gave the mortar a certain elasticity. Sometimes it was animal blood, used in a few specialized stretches of masonry where unusual strength was required. The sticky rice version was the one that won on the northern wall, because it was the one that scaled. Rice was abundant enough in a unified empire with a working grain trade to be poured by the cart into iron pots beside long stretches of construction. The wall held because someone, at some point, did the boring math. So many bricks per mile of wall, so much mortar per brick, so much rice per pot of mortar, so many pots of mortar per day. The math gave a number of carts of rice per month, and someone far away made sure those carts arrived. That too was part of the recipe. The sun is gone now. The kiln yard is dim. The two men at the pot have wiped down their paddles and hung them on a peg on the side of the brick stove. The boy has banked the fire so it will hold a low warmth through the night. Somewhere down the slope in the village, kitchen lamps are coming on, but behind the recipe stood the people who paid for it, and the strange currency that moved sacks of millet and pots of rice and loads of lime to a wall on the edge of the empire. Tomorrow morning, somewhere far to the south, a merchant would be loading a cart, and the trade he was making would not in the end be a trade for money. It would be a trade for salt. Far from the war, in a market town in the warmest south, a merchant is loading a cart at dawn. The cart is wooden, narrow, and tall, and the sacks he is loading are heavy with millet, not rice, not wheat, but the small, hard yellow grain of the north. He has bought it cheap. He will sell it for nothing at all, and he is making today a very rich trade. The trade on paper looks almost insulting. The merchant will carry these sacks of millet hundreds of miles over rough roads and unfriendly weather, all the way to a garrison town behind the northern wall. He will hand them over to the garrison's quartermaster. He will receive in return a small slip of paper. The slip will have a seal on it. The seal will say that this merchant, having delivered so many sacks of grain to so many soldiers, is entitled to buy a certain number of pounds of salt from a government depot far to the east. The slip is called a yarnia, a salt voucher. It is in this century one of the most valuable scraps of paper in China. Salt in Ming China was a state monopoly. You could not just go and harvest it. You could not just go and buy it. The government produced it. The government priced it, and the government decided who was allowed to resell it. A salt voucher meant you were allowed. With a salt voucher in your sleeve, you could go to a depot on the coast, hand over a fraction of what the salt was worth, walk away with a cart of it, and sell it for a comfortable profit in any market in the empire. So the trade made sense. The merchant carried millet to the war. The army got fed. The merchant got salt. The empire moved tons of grain across hundreds of miles without ever having to budget the carts. This system was called kaizhong. It was, in modern language, a kind of public-private partnership for frontier logistics. It was invented because the Ming court had a problem that bedeviled every dynasty before it. How do you feed an army on the edge of the world if you cannot afford to ship its food yourself? The answer in the early Ming had been even more striking. Soldiers, the founder of the dynasty decided, would not eat the empire's grain at all. Soldiers would grow their own. This was the tunbing system. Each garrison was given a large tract of state-owned farmland, called tuntian, military colony land, beside or behind the wall. Each soldier was allotted a plot. He was expected to work it, with his family if he had one, in shifts that rotated with his duties on the wall. He was, in a quiet daily way, a farmer who happened to wear armor when his name came up on the patrol roster. It was a beautiful idea on paper. The state would not pay its frontier army in coin. The state would only pay its frontier army in land. The army would feed itself. The wall would be staffed by men who had a personal reason to defend it, because their own millet was growing within sight of the watchtowers. In practice, of course, it did not stay simple. Soldiers were tired from one job and bad at the other. Their families struggled. Their land was sometimes too poor to feed them. By the middle of the Ming, garrisons all along the wall were quietly buying grain from merchants like the one with the cart, paid for not in coin, but in those small valuable slips of salt voucher paper. Picture the cart now, finally, at the wall. It has been weeks on the road. The merchant is tired. His mule is tired. The sacks of millet have been rained on once, brushed off, rained on again and patched. He arrives at a garrison gate in the late afternoon, when the long shadows of the watchtowers are already lying across the road in front of him. The gate is not closed. It is rarely closed in daylight. Two soldiers with halberds stand to either side. Inside the gate, a courtyard. Inside the courtyard, a clerk at a low table with a brush and a stack of paper. The merchant pulls his cart up beside the clerk. The clerk stands. He walks down the side of the cart, counting sacks. He marks a tally on his paper. He gestures the merchant inside. In an office off the courtyard, The quartermaster weighs a sack on a balance. He samples the millet between his fingers, smells it, lets it fall. He nods. He writes a number in a ledger. He stamps a slip of paper with a red seal. He hands the slip to the merchant. The merchant tucks it inside his coat, against his ribs, where nothing short of a careful thief will find it. He bows. He leaves. The cart, lighter now by every sack on it, rolls back through the gate and starts the long, slow way home. Up in the quartermaster's storeroom, the millet is poured into a tall wooden bin. From this bin, every morning at dawn, a measured scoop of grain, 1 sheng per man per day, is taken out for each soldier on the roster. 1 sheng is roughly the volume of a small bowl. It is not a lot of food. It is enough to keep a man working. Most of the time the soldier turns his sheng of millet into a thick porridge in an iron pot. Sometimes he turns it into mi bing, a soldier's marching bread, millet flour cooked into a paste and shaped into a dense hard loaf that will keep in a satchel for days. Either way, the millet is the foundation of the day. The pickled vegetables, the cabbage in brine, the rare lump of pork fat, they are all just things laid on top of the millet. And then, at the end of the day, there is tea. Not loose tea, the way it is drunk in the South. On the frontier, tea arrives compressed. It is pressed into hard rectangular bricks, dark brown and faintly fragrant, the size and the weight of a small book. A piece of the brick is shaved off with a small knife into a cup. Hot water is added, and the tea steeps slow and strong and slightly bitter in the cold air of a tower room. The same tea brick, by the way, is currency. It is what the Ming traders take to the Mongols at the licensed gates farther up the wall, where horses change hands for tea. But that is a story for a little later. For now, just imagine the cup of dark tea in the cold hand of a soldier whose dinner was a bowl of millet, and whose pay this month was a plot of land and the right to drink hot water by a brazier in a brick tower he helped to build. The Kaizuken system did not appear out of nowhere. Earlier dynasties had tried other schemes for feeding their frontier armies. The Han, far to the south of the wall in time, had used a system of forced grain shipments from interior provinces. The Tang had paid soldiers in cloth, in silk, sometimes in coin. The Song, in the late 11th century, had experimented with their own version of salt vouchers, but the experiment had run into corruption and quiet sabotage from the salt merchants who liked the old way better. By the time the early Ming was setting up its frontier, the lessons of those earlier attempts were sitting in the imperial archive. Read carefully by the men who designed the new system. They borrowed what had worked. They redesigned what had not. The result was Kaizhong, a system clever enough to keep a wall fed for 150 years before its own internal contradictions began to wear it down. The merchant in our story is part of an entire class of men who by this point in the late Ming have built whole careers on the long road between southern grain markets and northern garrison gates. They form a kind of informal guild. They know each other's names. They know which inns on the long road have decent millet porridge and which have weevils in it. They know which sections of the road to avoid in the wet season because of bandits. They know which garrison quartermasters are easy to deal with, and which will quibble for an hour over the weight of a sack. They pass this information down from father to son, the way the soldiers up at the wall pass down their hereditary military status. Their salt vouchers, by the way, are themselves a kind of secondary currency. A merchant who is in a hurry, or who does not feel like making the long trip to the coastal salt depot himself, can sell his vouchers to another merchant who specializes in that part of the trade. The voucher market has its own quiet pricing. The price moves with the season, with the political weather, with how many garrisons have ordered grain that month. There are men in the southern cities who do nothing but trade in salt vouchers without ever touching a sack of either grain or salt. The wall, in this oblique way, has created an entire small financial system in the towns of the empire it was built to defend. Up in the storeroom at the garrison gate, the quartermaster has finished sorting the day's deliveries. He keeps 2 ledgers, one for grain in and one for grain out. The grain in ledger is the one that backs the salt vouchers he issues. The grain out ledger is the one that tracks how many rations he has handed to how many soldiers. The 2 ledgers, kept honestly, should agree. Most months they more or less do. Some months they do not, for reasons that the quartermaster prefers not to examine too closely. Every quartermaster develops his own quiet methods for reconciling the small unexplained gaps. Most of them are not dishonest, they are simply tired. In the courtyard outside the storeroom, a soldier farmer has come down off the wall for a rest day. He is on his way to his plot of land on the south slope, where his wife has been pruning a vegetable garden by herself for 3 days. He carries a small wooden hoe over his shoulder. He carries a tea brick wrapped in cloth in his coat. He carries in his head a list of small things that need doing on the plot, a section of fence that has begun to lean, a row of onions that needs thinning, a place where the goat got through last week and ate a row of cabbage seedlings down to the stem. He passes the storeroom without going in. He nods to the clerk at the table. The clerk nods back. They have nodded to each other every few days for nearly 15 years. Neither of them remembers any more exactly when they started. The hereditary nature of the soldier's life is one of the quieter peculiarities of the Ming frontier system. A soldier's son was a soldier. A soldier's grandson would be a soldier. The status passed down through the family with the same logic as a small farm. Some men resented it. Some left, walked off in the night, became outlaws in the hills. Most stayed. Most could not really imagine doing anything else. By the late Ming, generations of these men had been born in the garrison villages along the wall and had never traveled more than 50 miles from the brick stretches their grandfathers had helped to build. The wall was their place. The wall was their job. The wall was, in some sense, their family. Back inside the storeroom, the quartermaster lights a lamp. He closes the grain in ledger. He sets it carefully on the shelf beside the grain out ledger. He sits at his table for a long, quiet moment, listening to the small sounds of the gate winding down for the evening, the clerk's stool scraping, a horse blowing through its nose somewhere in the courtyard, the slow tread of a soldier walking the perimeter wall. Far across the courtyard, beyond the storeroom, the watchtower itself was waking up, and inside it lived a quieter surprise, a surprise that one late Ming general had built into the wall on purpose. Before a man named Qi Ji Wang got to it, the watchtower was a hard place to be. It was solid. That was its strength and its trouble. The early Ming towers, raised along the wall in the first generations of the dynasty, were essentially blocks, a square or rectangular base of stone and brick, filled in solid all the way up. On top of the block sat a small open platform, sometimes with a low wooden hut for shelter. Inside the hut, if you were lucky, a brazier. Around you the weather, and beyond the weather the steppe. A sentry posted to one of these towers had a long exposed shift. He stood or sat on a small high square of stone, looking outward over the country to the north. In summer the sun beat on him. In winter the wind cut him. If he saw something, he had to start a fire fast and hope the next tower saw the smoke. If the something came closer, if it turned out to be a raiding party with bows, there was nowhere to go. The tower was solid below him. He could not retreat into it. He could only crouch down behind the low wall of his platform and hope. Most of the time, of course, nothing came. Most days on the wall were quiet, but the design of the tower assumed the rare bad day rather than the common quiet one. It was a structure built for the alarm, not for the long uneventful watch in between. In 1568, a general named Qi Ji Wang was placed in charge of the Long Ji Shen stretch of the wall, the section that runs from the sea at Shanhaiguan inland to the pass at Juyongguan, just north of Beijing. He had spent the earlier part of his career fighting pirates on the southern coast, where he had become known for paying attention to small practical details that other generals overlooked. He arrived at the wall with a question that, in hindsight, looks obvious. If a man is going to spend most of his career on a watchtower, why is the tower not built to hold him? Over the next 14 years, Qi Ji Wang answered that question in brick. He redesigned the watchtower. The new towers were hollow. Inside the brick walls, instead of a solid mass of fill, there was a room, sometimes 2 rooms, on 2 floors. Each room had a low arched ceiling, a small brick stove or brazier, narrow slit windows for light and ventilation, and shelves cut into the wall for storage. Bedrolls could be laid out at night. Grain could be stacked in jars. Spare arrows and crossbow bolts could be racked along one wall. There was room enough inside for a small garrison, perhaps 30 soldiers, perhaps 50, depending on the size of the tower, to live, sleep, cook, and shelter, all without having to come down to the village below. For a sentry, this was a different life. He could climb a short flight of brick stairs to his post on the roof, stand his watch, and then come back down into a warm, dry room when his shift was done. If the weather turned bad, he watched from inside, through a slit. If an arrow came, the brick took it. If a small raiding party arrived, the tower could hold them off without retreating, because every soldier in the room could shoot from a different slit. Qi Ji Wang built more than 1,000 of these hollow watchtowers along the wall. The estimate is roughly 1,017 of them, though no one quite knows the exact number anymore. Each was assigned 30 to 50 picked soldiers. Together they turned a long line of brittle alarm posts into something more like a chain of small fortified houses, each within smoke signal distance of the next. If you have ever been to the Great Wall, you have probably seen his work without knowing it. The stretches that most travelers walk on today, Mutianyu, Jinsanling, Simatai, are essentially Qi Ji Wang's project. The square brick towers with the small arched windows, the way they sit at regular intervals along the ridges, the way the wall feels less like a defensive line and more like a long village strung along the mountains, that is his design. One late Ming general, working from 1568 to 1582, shaped the silhouette that the world now pictures when it pictures the Great Wall. Step inside one of those towers now, in our particular evening, somewhere along the Zhijian line in the autumn of the late 16th century. The air is cooler inside than out. It always is. The brick walls hold the cold of the night and let it go slowly through the day. A low brazier in the middle of the floor is glowing under an iron kettle. Steam comes off the spout in a thin white line. Around the brazier, bedrolls have been laid out in a loose ring. Coats and quilted jackets hang on wooden pegs driven between the bricks. A small stack of jars in one corner holds millet, pickled cabbage, and a few hard-cured strips of pork fat. The arrow slits in the wall are narrow vertical strips, no wider than a hand. Through them this evening slivers of pale grey sky. As the light dies outside, the slits darken one by one until they are simply dark vertical lines on the wall. Then the first stars appear in them, one star per slit, like a row of small lanterns hung in a window. A soldier sits cross-legged near the brazier, mending a sandal with a thick curved needle. Another lies on his back on a bedroll, one arm across his eyes. A third is on the roof above, doing the last watch of the day, his footsteps a soft, slow rhythm on the brick over their heads. None of them speak. There is no need to speak. The tower has been theirs for years. They know one another's silences the way a family knows them. The kettle begins to mutter. The soldier with the sandal looks up, lifts the kettle off the brazier with a folded cloth, and pours a thin stream of hot water into a clay cup. The cup already holds a curl of tea shaved from a brick. The room fills slowly with the faintly bitter smell of dark tea brewing in cold air. Outside the wall is darkening. Inside the wall is the room. The bricks the bricklayer set 5 springs ago, with the pale grey mortar from the iron pot beside the kiln. The bricks stamped on their undersides with the name of the kiln and the foreman are now the walls of a small warm house at the end of a long ridge. This is what Qi Ji Wang built, not a line, a row of small houses 20 feet thick that happen to be joined by a stone road on the sky. Before we leave Qi Ji Wang and his 1,000 towers, it is worth pausing for a moment on the man himself. He had not asked to be sent to the northern frontier. He had spent his 30s in the southeast, hunting pirates along the coast of Zhejiang and Fujian, where he had become famous for 2 things. The first was a system of drill that turned ordinary peasant conscripts into disciplined infantry in a matter of months. The second was a small green book of military essays called the Jixiao Xinshu that he wrote in his off hours and that would be read by Chinese officers for the next 300 years. By the time the court summoned him north in 1568, he was already, quietly, one of the most respected soldiers in the empire. He arrived at the wall in middle age. He had a wife who had followed him through every posting of his career, and he had by reputation a dry sense of humor that he reserved for the few staff officers he actually liked. He set up his headquarters in a town behind the wall and began to walk the line on horseback, accompanied by 2 or 3 engineers and a small escort of his picked southern infantry. He spent the first year mostly listening. He asked the local garrison commanders what was wrong with the wall as it stood. He asked the sentries on the old solid towers what they would want if someone asked. He asked the masons in the kiln yards what they could build, given enough bricks and enough time. Only at the end of that year did he begin to draw plans. The plans were practical to a degree that surprised some of the court officials reading them in Beijing. He specified the inside dimensions of the new towers in units that a working bricklayer would use, not in the ceremonial measurements of the imperial officers. He specified the height of the ceilings to accommodate a man standing upright in his armor with allowance for the helmet. He specified storage shelves at heights a soldier could reach without ladders. He specified arrow slits at angles calculated to give shooters cover from the directions raiders actually came from. The plans were boring in the way that very good engineering is boring. They were the work of a man who had been a soldier long enough to know what soldiers needed. The towers went up over the next 12 years. Many of them are still standing. A few have collapsed. A few have been rebuilt by careful modern restorers using bricks made in the same kilns by descendants of the same families, with mortar mixed by the same recipe in the same kind of iron pot beside the same kind of stove. The continuity is, in places, almost embarrassing. It is hard to look at the inside of a hollow tower on the Mutianyu stretch and believe that 400 years separate you from the soldier who first laid out his bedroll on its floor. Inside our particular tower this evening, the soldiers are settling into the long quiet of an autumn night. The kettle has gone off the brazier. The cups have been wiped out with a cloth. The bedrolls are unrolled in their loose ring around the brazier. One soldier has begun to play very quietly on a small wooden flute he keeps in a cloth bundle by his pillow. The flute makes a thin, breathy sound that fits the cold air. He plays a few bars of a tune that is old in this part of the country, and then he stops, and then he plays a few more bars, and then he sets the flute down on his coat and lies back. The room is full of small good sounds. The brazier ticks. The kettle creaks faintly as the metal cools. The wind outside brushes the top of the tower roof in long, slow passes. From the floor above, the soft, regular sound of the sentry's boots as he paces a circle around the platform. If you had told the men in this room, the night before Qi Jiwang's plans first arrived at the wall, that within a generation they would be sleeping inside the wall instead of on top of it, they would have found the idea hard to imagine. The tower had always been a place you climbed up to and stood on. The idea that a tower could be a room, a warm, dry, defended room with shelves of grain and a row of bedrolls, belonged, in their world, to a barracks down in the village. The wall was hard. The wall was for the alarm. The wall was for the rare bad day. Qi Ji Wang, in his quiet way, had taken the rare bad day and the common quiet one, and said that both of them belonged to the same place. The tower would do both jobs. The soldier would live in his own duty. The wall, for the first time in the long history of these mountains, would be a place where a man could spend his career without ever quite leaving home. The soldier with the flute turns his face to the wall. The brazier is dim now. The room is going dark. Above them on the roof, the sentry's footsteps pause, and then resume, and so as the tower settled into the evening, far down the slope, a different kind of fire was already being lit on a tower a mile to the east. The language of smoke was about to speak. The first column of smoke went up a mile to the east, at the hour the soldiers called the second watch of the evening, when the light along the ridge was the color of cold tea. The sentry on our tower saw it before anyone else did. He had been leaning against the low wall on the roof, his hands tucked under his arms for warmth, when something in the corner of his eye made him turn. There, against the pale strip of sky still left in the west, a single thin column of grey climbing slowly upward from the next tower along the ridge. One column. He did not move quickly. He had been trained very carefully not to move quickly. He stood up from the low wall and looked along the line to confirm. Yes, one. A single column, no other rising beside it, climbing thin and steady from the next tower's signal platform. One column meant a small thing. It meant, in the formal language of the system that had been written down a century before, that a small party of riders had been spotted from that tower somewhere on the country to the north. The number was understood to be modest, up to 100, a scouting party perhaps, a handful of horsemen on the steppe, worth knowing, not yet worth fearing. The sentry turned to the small brazier on the platform beside him, where dried grass and pine needles waited under a cone of cut wood. He kindled the bundle. He shielded it for a moment from the wind with his coat. Then he stepped back, and a slow column of pale grey smoke began to climb from his own tower into the sky to the west. One column passed on. In the next moment, a mile to the west, another sentry on another tower saw it, and stood up and lit his own. And so the message travelled along the ridge, one tower at a time, faster than any horse could carry it, faster than a runner could run it. The sky above the wall had become a slow, careful conversation. The code was not new that evening. It had been formalized in writing in 1468, almost 100 years before, by Ming officials who wanted every garrison along the wall to speak the same language. The rule, in its simplest form, ran like this. One column of smoke and one cannon shot meant up to 100 enemies on the country beyond. 2 columns and 2 shots meant about 500. 3 columns and 3 shots meant more than 1,000. The numbers were not exact. They were not meant to be. They were brackets. They told the next tower roughly how heavy the weather coming over the steppe was, so that the towers further down the line could begin to prepare in the right key. There was a small further refinement. By day smoke, by night fire. This was not arbitrary either. In bright sun, a flame is almost invisible at distance, but smoke holds against the blue. In darkness, smoke disappears, but a single high flame can be seen for miles. So the choice of medium changed with the angle of the sun. On a hard winter evening, when the daylight failed early, the sentries shifted from smoke to fire halfway through their watch, without ever needing to say so. The wall changed its language as the sky changed. There were even refinements within the refinements. The number of cannon shots paired with the smoke, the presence or absence of a third or fourth column, the brief instructions on which towers, in which sectors, should also raise a flag of a particular color from a high pole. In the most elaborate sections, you could read off the smoke not only the rough number of enemies, but a guess at their direction. The wall had become in this sense an early telegraph, not a fast one, not a precise one, but over distances that no horse could cover in a useful time. It could pass a sentence. Our sentry on our tower has finished kindling his column. He steps back. He watches. The smoke rises. He looks again at the next tower to the east. It is also still smoking. One column, no second column joining it. The original message stands, 100 or fewer, likely a scouting party. The captain on the floor below will be told when the soldier off the next watch climbs down to relieve him. For now, the sentry simply stands, breath in slow visible clouds, and watches. It is hard to overstate how quiet this kind of alarm is. There is no shouting, there is no panic. The sentries do not run. They light a careful fire, they tend it, and they go back to watching. Most nights, no one comes. Most columns of smoke turn out to be a Mongol hunting party drifting after deer, or a single rider on a horse, or a dust trail thrown up by wind on dry grass. The wall has learned over 150 years of this code, to be careful without being afraid. The wind on the platform shifts. The column of smoke leans, then straightens again. Far below in the valley, lanterns are being lit in the village. From a tower further west, a faint answering column is rising now, a small pale brushstroke against the deep blue. The line of conversation has reached the next sector. It will keep going. By the time the smoke has reached the third or fourth tower, the original sighting from the eastern slope is already a quarter of an hour old. By the time it reaches the garrison headquarters 50 miles down the wall, an officer will already know, without needing a runner, that something small has moved on the country to the north. The sky to the west is the color of cold ash now. The first stars are out. The sentry on our tower lets his small fire burn down. There is no need to keep it going any longer. The message has been passed. The conversation has moved on, and his column has done its work. He sits down on the low wall, his back to the freshly cold brick, and looks again at the country beyond. The country is dark. The country is mostly empty. A small thing has happened out there, and most likely a smaller thing will follow, and most likely both will fade by morning. It is worth pausing here to think about what the beacon code actually achieved as a communication system. From end to end, the Ming Wall ran roughly 8,800 kilometers from Shanhai Guan on the eastern sea to Jiayuguan in the desert far to the west. No horse could carry a message that distance in less than weeks. No runner could carry it at all. And yet, in principle, a column of smoke lit at one end of the wall could be relayed, tower by tower, all the way to the other end in less than a day, given good weather and alert sentries. The wall was, in this sense, the longest piece of continuous infrastructure in the world for the rapid transmission of news, and it would remain so until the first telegraph cables were laid across the same country on different routes 400 years later. In practice, of course, no message ever traveled the full length of the wall. The wall was administered in sectors, each sector with its own garrison headquarters, and most signals stayed within a few days' ride of the tower that had first lit them. A column of smoke seen by a sentry at the eastern end of one sector would be relayed west until it reached the garrison headquarters of that sector, where an officer would decide whether to send a runner south to the higher command or to extinguish the alarm. Most alarms were extinguished within a few towers. The system was, in modern language, hierarchical. It had local handling. Only the largest threats, 3 columns, 3 cannon shots, a sustained alarm holding for an hour or more, were considered serious enough to be passed up the chain. The sentries who tended these signals were trained for years. There was, in fact, a small manual that circulated through the garrison schools, written in plain language, with diagrams showing how many columns went with how many shots. New sentries memorized it. They were tested on it by their captains. They practiced lighting the kindling cones in all weathers. They learned how to shelter a flame from wind, how to feed a fire so that the smoke rose in a clean vertical column rather than spreading sideways, how to read the smoke of the next tower in the slant of an autumn afternoon when the sun was low and the wind was bad. There was an art to it. A bad sentry could mistake a cooking fire for an alarm, or miss an alarm entirely because he was looking the wrong way. A good sentry could read just from the look of the next tower's smoke whether the fire over there was a fresh alarm or one that had been burning for some time. A very good sentry could read from the patterns of smoke across an entire ridge the general mood of the wall on a given afternoon. The work was patient and physical and a little bit poetic, and the men who did it well were proud of doing it well. Our sentry on our tower is one of the good ones. He has been on this stretch of wall for 11 years. He knows every tower he can see by name. He knows their captains. He knows the small private signals that some sectors use, in addition to the official code, to tell each other things the manual does not cover. A single short puff of smoke, followed by 2 longer ones, for example, means at one stretch of wall that the cook in the garrison kitchen has just put a fresh pot of porridge on, and that anyone coming off shift soon is welcome to come down and have a bowl. The official code was for war. The unofficial codes were for everything else. He watches his column of smoke thin in the dusk. He thinks, briefly, of nothing in particular. He thinks then of his wife in the garrison village down the slope, who is probably at this hour cooking. He thinks of his son, who is 14 and has begun to take his first practice shifts at a tower further along the wall, learning the work that his father and grandfather both did before him. He thinks of the long line of men, stretching back through generations of his own family, who have stood on this kind of platform, on this kind of evening, and watched this kind of smoke rise. The cold is settling in for the night. He pulls his coat tighter. He stamps his feet a few times against the brick to keep the blood moving. Below him in the room, the other soldiers are settling in for the long evening. The kettle is on the brazier. The cups are being filled. The original alarm has faded out of the line now. No new columns have risen anywhere to the east. The Mongol scouting party, whatever it was, has either turned back or moved on, and the wall has gone quiet again. The system has worked. It has done what it was built to do: pass a small piece of careful news across a long distance, and then return to silence. He looks once more along the ridge to the east. Dark towers, faint and regular, against a darker sky. No smoke, no fire, no movement on the country beyond. The wall is in this hour simply the wall. He breathes out a long, slow breath. He can see it in the cold, long after the last column had thinned into the cold air. The gates farther down the slope were quietly opening for another kind of traffic. The country to the north, of course, was not only a place that sometimes sent raiders. Most of the time it was a place that sent horses, and the wall, for all its watchtowers, had been built with that fact in mind. The wall was not one wall. That is the first thing to understand as we walk down off the ridge toward a small town that sits in the saddle between two stretches of stone. Travelers like to picture the wall as a single unbroken line, sealing one country off from the other, with the watchtowers as its eyes and the soldiers as its hands. In some places, in some seasons, this is more or less true, but in most places, in most seasons, the wall was something quieter and more interesting and considerably more porous than that. The wall, in many places, was a gate. Gates ran through it at intervals. Some were huge, double-leafed, iron-bound, official passes where official caravans came and went with seals from the imperial government. Some were smaller, low and modest, just a stone arch through the wall with a wooden door on either side, guarded by a handful of soldiers and a clerk with a brush. And some, here and there along the long line, were quieter still, little doors set into the bottom of the wall, half hidden in shadow, opened only on particular days, for particular purposes that the clerks knew about, and most travelers did not. The town we are walking down into now is one of the places where those gates were busiest. It is, in some sense, the most important small town on this stretch of wall. Its name is Datong, and its life, for almost 2 centuries, has revolved around the trade of horses. The Ming court had a complicated feeling about the steppe to the north. On the one hand, it built a wall to keep the steppe out. On the other hand, it deeply needed what the steppe had. The empire's armies needed horses, and the best horses in the world, for the kind of war the Ming was forced to fight, came from the grasslands beyond the wall. Mongol breeders had been raising them for centuries. The empire's own horse breeding programs, repeatedly attempted, had repeatedly disappointed. So the wall, for all its hardness, was built with a small, soft place in it, a place where horses could legally come south. The trade was not free. It was tightly licensed. A Mongol trader who wanted to bring horses to a market like Tatong had to come through a designated gate on a designated day with the right credentials. Once inside the small market courtyard behind the gate, his horses were inspected, counted, and weighed in a way against the goods the Han merchants had brought to exchange: tea, silk, salt, iron tools, sometimes a little silver. The exchange happened slowly. A horse was a serious thing. A trader might spend half a day arguing over the price of one. For a long time the system was on and off. When relations with the steppe were strained, the markets closed. When raiders had come over the wall the year before, the market stayed closed. When a new Khan rose on the steppe and signaled, in the careful diplomatic way these things are signaled, that he was ready to be reasonable, the markets reopened. The reopenings were treaties in their own right. They were the way an emperor and a Khan agreed, without saying so, that there would not be war this year. The most important of these treaties came in 1571, in the early years of the Wanli reign, when after decades of friction with the Mongol leader Altan Khan, the court agreed to formally reopen the horse fairs along the northern wall. The treaty had 5 main provisions. The first was simple. Trade markets would be held on the frontiers. Horse fairs would resume. After the formal reopening, the years that followed were, by frontier standards, a long quiet spell. Trade flowed. Smoke columns went up rarely. Picture the market behind the gate at first light now, in our particular autumn, a few seasons after the treaty has settled in. The courtyard is still cold. The horses, brought south in the night by their Mongol owners, are tied in a long line under a low stone overhang. Their breath is silver in the air. They are smaller, shaggier, more compact than the horses raised down in the lowlands. They are also by reputation tougher in winter, sure on broken ground, and considerably more dependable on long rides. A Han clerk at a low wooden table is laying out goods: bolts of pale silk in 3 colors, a small open box of loose iron arrowheads, a neat stack of tea bricks, each one dark brown and faintly fragrant, a weighted bag of salt, a scale beside him for weighing silver if it comes to that. He works without hurry. The day will be long. The Mongol traders, on the other side of the line of horses, are doing what traders do everywhere. They are talking quietly among themselves. They are not quite looking at the goods on the clerk's table. They are letting the clerk make the first move. The clerk knows this. He has been doing this for years. A soldier stands at each corner of the courtyard, a halberd grounded beside him, doing nothing in particular but being there. He is a Tunbing, a soldier farmer, like the men we met yesterday up at the storeroom. His winter is spent here, in the market courtyard, watching the trade. His summer will be spent in a field on the south slope, watching the millet grow. Tonight, when the trade is done, he will go back to a small house in the garrison village and eat the millet his wife is cooking, and drink a cup of the tea he has just watched walk to the steppe in the form of a brick. A horse is led forward. The clerk stands. He runs a hand along the animal's flank. He lifts a hoof. He looks at the teeth, the way you look at a calendar. He says a number. The Mongol trader says another. They stand for a moment in the long, comfortable silence of a price not yet agreed. Outside the wall, the sky is going from pale grey to pale rose. Frost is on the ground at the edges of the courtyard. The horses shift their weight, 1 foot at a time. A second horse is led up, then a third. The trade moves slowly, the way the wall itself moves slowly through the country, doing the work it was built to do. By noon, deals will be done. By afternoon, the horses will have new owners. By evening, the Mongol traders will be back through the gate, riding north with their tea bricks and silk in saddlebags, and the new horses will be walking south into the empire towards stables a week away. The gate will close for the night. The wall for an hour will look like one unbroken line again. It was never really one unbroken line. It was a long, careful membrane, and the gates were the pores in it. Without the markets, the wall could not have held its peace half so long. The Mongol traders on their side of the line of horses are not a single group. Some of them are from clans that have lived for generations within a few days' ride of the wall, and who have been making this trip every autumn for as long as any of them can remember. They have grandfathers buried within sight of the wall on the northern side. They know the names of the Han clerks at the gate. They have eaten in the same garrison inns. The trade for them is not exactly an exchange between foreign powers. It is closer to a long-running business relationship between cousins who happen to live on opposite sides of a particular stretch of stone. Some others have come from much farther up the steppe. They have ridden for 2 or 3 weeks across grass that turned near the wall from green to gold and then to brown as the season changed. They are quieter at the market. They watch the Han clerks more carefully. They speak among themselves in a dialect that the other Mongol traders sometimes need to translate. They are here because the news of the open horse fair has spread through the grasslands, and because the horses they have brought are the best of their year's herd, and because somewhere up north a clan elder has decided that this autumn the trade with the south is worth the long ride. Between these two groups of traders, an entire small social world has formed in the market courtyard. The locals advise the newcomers on what to ask for. The newcomers bring the locals news from far up the steppe. Both groups together drink a small ceremonial cup of fermented mare's milk before the first trade of the morning, poured from a leather skin by the oldest of the Mongol traders present. The Han clerk waits politely while this happens. He has seen the cup poured every morning of every market day for years. He does not drink from it himself. He nods at the older trader. The trader nods back. The day begins. The horses themselves are a small revelation if you have only ever seen the larger, sleeker horses of the southern courts. Steppe horses are small. They are shaggy. They are not handsome by southern standards. Their legs are short. Their backs are broad. They look at first glance like a child's idea of a pony, and then you watch one carry a fully armored rider across broken ground for 10 hours without slowing, and you begin to understand why the Ming court was willing to do almost anything to keep these horses coming south. A Han cavalry officer arrives at the market in the middle of the morning to inspect the day's offerings. He is a buyer for one of the imperial stables, and he has been doing this for many years. He walks the line of horses with the patience of a man who has bought 10,000 of them in his career. He looks at the eyes, he looks at the teeth, he runs his hand down the leg, he picks up the hoof, examines the underside, sets it down, he moves to the next horse. He says almost nothing. The Mongol traders watch him from a respectful distance. They know that whatever this man marks down in his small bound book will set the price for the rest of the day's trade. By midday the buying is brisk. The clerk's stack of tea bricks has begun to shrink. The bolt of pale silk has been mostly cut. The bag of salt has been weighed out 3 times. The Mongol traders have started loading saddlebags. The horses, by now belonging to new owners, are being walked one by one to a holding pen at the far end of the courtyard, where a stable hand is leading them through a small gate into a long stone corridor that connects eventually to the southern road. Outside the wall, the sun has cleared the ridge to the east. The cold is going out of the air. The frost on the courtyard stones has melted into thin dark patches. The day is beginning to feel almost warm. The trade, which began in silver breath and pale rose light, is now happening in plain sunshine, and somehow that takes away some of the strangeness of it. By the angle of the sun, this is just a market, just 2 groups of people exchanging what they have for what they need, just an ordinary autumn day on a small frontier. The hand clerk pours himself a second cup of tea from a kettle that has been sitting on a small brazier beside his table all morning. He drinks it slowly. He watches a young Mongol trader leading away a pack horse newly loaded with 3 bolts of silk and a small box of iron arrowheads. The trader looks pleased. The clerk lifts his cup to the trader very slightly. The trader does not see it. The clerk drinks his tea. The wall, above all of this, stands in the morning sun. The watchtowers, dim and small against the bright sky, look almost decorative. From inside the market courtyard, it is very easy to forget that the wall was built to keep the very people who are trading inside it out. The wall has been doing this other thing, this slow, patient gating of trade, this careful regulation of exchange, for so long that the other thing has come to seem like what it was for in the first place. And so as the market eased into its slow hours, the small houses on the southern slope began their own quieter day. The garrison village was waking up. The garrison village sits on the south slope of the ridge, in the long, soft pocket of shadow that the wall casts in late afternoon. The houses are low. The roofs are tile, grey and brown, set at angles that catch the slanting light. The streets are narrow. Between the houses, small kitchen gardens. Behind the houses, low pens for goats and a few thin chickens. Above the houses, always the dark line of the wall. Nothing dramatic happens in this hour. It is one of the loveliest hours of the day in any small place, and the village knows it. The morning's work is done. The evening's work has not yet begun. The slope is half in shadow and half in pale gold light, and the air is starting to cool. A woman is hanging washing on a line stretched between 2 posts in a small courtyard. The washing is mostly the rough cotton tunics of soldier farmers, faded almost to grey by long sun. She pegs each one carefully, smoothing the shoulders, letting the wind take them. She does not look up the slope. She knows the wall is there. She has lived in its shadow her whole life. A boy carries 2 wooden buckets of water from the village well, one on each end of a yoke across his shoulders. He walks the way someone walks who has carried water this far before. His shoulders move in a slow, steady rhythm. The water sloshes only a little at each step. A goat is being led by a child who looks too small for the rope, from one pen to another. The goat is patient. The child is murmuring something at it, a string of small words that the goat clearly knows. Further up the slope, a soldier farmer is pulling a coat off a peg inside the low door of a small workshop. He has spent the afternoon on a section of wall, helping to lift a fresh stone into a gap where a coping had cracked over the summer. His hands are dusty with the pale grey mortar, the same mortar we watched being mixed in the iron pot beside the kiln 2 evenings ago. He brushes his palms against his trousers twice, and the dust comes off in small dry clouds. At the village well, 2 old men are sitting on a low stone bench talking. They are not talking about anything important. They are talking about a goat that has gone missing, and about a daughter who has just had a child, and about the way the autumn has come earlier this year than they remember. They have lived next to the wall their entire lives. Their fathers lived next to it. Their fathers' fathers were posted here when this stretch was new by a general who had a question about watchtowers. A cart rolls slowly down the main street of the village toward the storeroom at the lower end. It is not the merchant's cart we watched earlier. It is one of the village's own carts, going to pick up the day's millet ration for a section of the wall. The driver flicks the reins lightly. The mule moves at its own pace, which is the only pace mules know. The smell of cooking has begun to come from the houses, mostly millet porridge, sometimes a little pickled cabbage, sharp and faintly vinegary, from a stoneware jar that has been kept all summer in a cool corner. Sometimes, on a good evening, the deepest smell of pork fat melting in an iron pan. The kitchen fires are small. The houses are not large. The smoke is thin, and it rises straight up in the still air toward the dimming sky. In one house, a woman is grinding millet to flour on a small stone mill. The mill turns with a low, gritty sound. Slow, slow. She has been doing this for an hour. She will be doing it for another. The flour falls in a soft, pale stream onto a cloth beneath the stone. Later, she will mix it with water and shape it into the dense, round loaves of meebing that her husband will take with him into the watchtower tomorrow. Higher up, on a small terraced field, an old man is walking a line between rows of vegetables. He bends now and then to pull a weed, or to push a small stone aside with the side of his foot. He has been a farmer all his life. He has also been on the roster, a soldier. The two were never quite separate for him. The land he walks on tonight is the same land that his army pay was, formerly paid in. From higher up the slope still, where the wall begins, a single thin column of smoke is rising from one of the towers. Not an alarm, just a cooking fire, drifting up from the brazier in a tower's interior room, where a soldier is heating water for tea. The smoke is so thin and so unhurried that no one in the village even looks up at it. They have seen 10,000 of these small evening columns. They know what each one is. The child with the goat has reached the new pen. He swings the gate open. lets the goat in, and latches it. The goat walks to the corner of the pen and starts on a small heap of dry grass. The child stands for a moment watching before turning back toward home. The woman with the washing has finished. She gathers the empty basket against her hip and walks slowly back inside. The line behind her sways gently in the cooling air, the tunics moving like flags that have nothing to say. At the well, the two old men are still talking. The light has gone soft on their faces. They do not seem to notice. A lamp is lit inside one of the houses. The window square goes from grey to a warm orange, then a second lamp in another house, then a third. The village begins, very slowly, to glow from the inside. Above all of it, the wall holds the last grey light of the day on its top stones. The dark line above the rooftops is now a slightly paler line than the sky behind it. The watchtowers stand at their long intervals, dim and patient. From this far down the slope you cannot see whether the smoke from the eastern tower has died down yet, or whether a small fire is still burning quietly inside the room below. It does not matter. The towers know what they are doing. The village knows that the towers know. A dog somewhere barks twice and then is quiet. A pot lid clinks in a kitchen. A baby in another house begins to cry and then is hushed. Down at the end of the lane, beside a small low door that has been propped open with a stone, an older woman is sitting on a stool doing nothing in particular. Her hands are folded in her lap. Her eyes are on the slope across the valley, where the last light is moving along the stones of the wall. She has been the wife of 3 soldiers in her life, and she has buried 2 of them. Her third husband is still alive, and is in this hour on a section of wall a quarter of a mile to the east, helping to lift a coping stone back into place. She is waiting for him to come down. In the courtyard of a slightly larger house, 2 boys are playing a quiet game with a handful of polished stones. They are taking turns flicking the stones across a flat square scratched into the dirt with a stick. One of them is winning. Neither of them is keeping serious score. They will play this game most evenings of most weeks until the cold gets too sharp, at which point they will move the game inside to a kitchen floor by the fire and lose half the stones into the cracks between the boards. In the kitchen of the same house, the boy's mother is shaping mi bing on a wooden board. She has the soft skill of a woman who has shaped 1,000 of these loaves over the years. Her hands work the cooked millet paste into round, dense shapes the size of a small fist. She sets them on a square of cloth to cool. Her husband, who is at this moment doing the second shift at a tower further up the wall, will carry 6 of them out tomorrow morning in his coat to keep him fed through 3 days of duty. The smell from her kitchen mixes with the smell from the next kitchen over, where another wife is doing the same work for another husband. Up and down the lane, the same paste is being shaped on the same kind of wooden boards by the same kind of patient hands. The garrison village is, in this hour, a kind of slow communal kitchen, all of them quietly preparing the food that will keep the wall running for another 3 days. The children begin to come in. The boy with the goat, the girl who had been carrying water, a smaller child who had been chasing a chicken in someone else's yard. They are all summoned home by the smell of cooking and by the increasing dusk. Mothers stand in the low doorways and call. The children come, in their own time, the way children do, running for one stretch, dawdling for another, picking up small stones and sticks, and then dropping them again. Inside one of the larger houses, in a side room off the kitchen, an old woman is teaching a younger one to spin thread on a wooden spinning wheel. The wheel makes a soft, regular humming sound. The younger woman is concentrating. The older woman is not concentrating. Her hands know the work too well to need her mind. She is instead telling a long, quiet story about a festival many years ago, when the garrison commander had ordered a pig roasted in the village square for the whole community, in honor of a small victory on the wall that no one alive can quite remember the details of anymore. The younger woman listens. The wheel hums. The thread grows. Outside, the lamps continue to come on. The dark windows fill one by one with warm orange squares. The sky behind the wall is going through the long, slow color change of an autumn dusk, pale gray to pale rose to deep rose to indigo. The watchtowers on the ridge above are stark, dark shapes now, regular along the spine of the mountain. A soldier comes down off the wall by the small flight of stone steps at the lower end of the village. He walks slowly. His shift is done. He has the satisfied tiredness of a man who has spent a day doing physical work in cold air. He nods to a neighbor in the lane. He stops for a moment to admire the woman who has been spinning through the open side room window. He continues home. His wife meets him at the door with a bowl of millet porridge in one hand and a small cup of warmed wine in the other. He kisses her on the forehead. He sits down on the low bench beside the kitchen fire. He eats slowly. He says almost nothing. She does not need him to say anything. She has known him for 20 years. The village settles in. The lamps stay on. The voices from the houses are low, indistinct, comfortable. The murmur of families eating together. A dog walks down the middle of the lane and lies down in front of a particular doorway. The dog has lain down in front of this doorway every night for years. The door opens. A hand sets a small bowl of scraps on the stones. The dog eats, and so as the lamps in the village dimmed one by one to a soft, constant glow, the wall above them held the last grey light of the day, and the long, slow hours of the night began to gather around the small houses on the slope. Night comes to the wall the way it comes to a river, slowly, from the bottom upward, from the cold edges inward. In the valley, the village is dark first. The lamps are still lit inside the houses, but the slope around them has gone deep blue, and the windows look like small warm coins set into a wide cool field. The roofs are dark. The streets are dark. The pen where the goat is sleeping is dark, and the goat is asleep. Higher up on the slope, the terraced fields hold a little more light. The bare furrows catch a thin pale silver where the moon is starting to rise behind the ridge to the east. The vegetable rows are tidy lines of shadow. The old man's small stone bench at the edge of the field is empty now. He went inside an hour ago. Higher still, on the wall itself, the last light of the day has gone. The stones which held a soft gold along their tops only a little while ago are now the same deep blue as the sky behind them. The watchtowers are dim square shapes, regular along the ridge, dark on dark. Inside one of those towers, a brazier is glowing low. The iron kettle has come off the heat. A soldier is sitting on a bedroll with his back against the brick wall, drinking the last of his cup of tea. The room is warm. The room is small. The other soldiers are mostly asleep, breathing in the slow, long rhythm of people who have been on a watch. The sentry on the roof of the tower is doing the second to last shift of the night. He is sitting on the low wall, his coat pulled tight, his hands tucked under his arms. The brazier on the platform beside him is glowing softly, a small warm patch in the dark. He is not watching for anything in particular. He is just watching. The moon has cleared the eastern ridge now. It comes up large and pale and silver, the way the autumn moon comes up. The wall in this light takes on a new shape. It looks less like a barrier and more like a river of stone moving very slowly along the spine of the mountains. The watchtowers in this light look like small brick boats moored at regular intervals on the river. The sentry on his low wall sees this every night. He still likes it. A night bird calls somewhere down the slope. One slow note, then a pause, then another, then nothing. The cold pools at the foot of the wall where the slope steepens. The grass there is silver with the beginning of frost. A small fox, somewhere along the line, is moving in the shadow of the stones, hunting for whatever moves in the cold. The lamp in the woman's window has gone out. The lamp in the next house has gone out. The village is mostly dark now. One small orange square remains, far down the lane, where someone is sitting up later than the rest. Then that too goes dark. The sentry on his low wall lets his eyes adjust. The country to the north is wide and dark and silver. There is no movement on it that he can see. There is no thin column of smoke rising anywhere along the ridge. The wall, in this hour, is silent. He thinks briefly about the brick under his hand. The brick has a stamp on its underside, set there in clay nearly 100 years ago. The brick is held to the next brick by a pale grey mortar mixed with sticky rice in an iron pot beside a kiln long since cold. The brick is one of millions. The brick is doing exactly what it was made to do. The sentry shifts his weight. The brick does not move. Below him, in the room, the soldier with the teacup has set the cup down and lain back on his bedroll. He is looking up at the low arched brick ceiling, which is dim and rough in the brazier light. He is thinking about nothing in particular. He is letting the day go. His breath slows. His eyes close. The brazier glows. The kettle ticks faintly as it cools. A mile to the east, on another tower, another sentry is doing exactly the same shift, and another soldier inside is lying on exactly the same kind of bedroll, and another brazier is glowing exactly the same low orange under exactly the same low arched ceiling. A mile to the west, the same. The wall goes on and on along the ridges in both directions, tower to tower, in this slow, soft rhythm. 1,017 of these small, warm rooms, perhaps. No one ever counted exactly. The estimate is enough. The night thickens. The moon climbs. The frost spreads quietly in the grass at the foot of the stones. A breath of wind moves along the top of the wall, and then is still again. Nothing comes from the country to the north. Nothing comes from the country to the south. The wall stands, the watchtowers stand, the villages on the slope stand, lamps long out. The sentry shifts again. He looks toward the eastern sky, where the moon now hangs free of the ridge, large and silver and serene. He looks back to the country. He folds his arms a little tighter. He settles in for the last hour of his shift. Inside the room, the soldier on the bedroll is breathing in the long, slow way of sleep. His face is soft. His hand is open on his chest. The cup beside him holds the last cold bit of dark tea, untouched. The brazier dims a little. The kettle is quiet now. Outside, the wall holds its long line through the moonlight, brick on brick, joint on joint, mortar holding what it has held for centuries. Nothing here is in a hurry. Nothing here needs to be. The hours move slowly. The night has its own rhythm, and the wall keeps to it. In the middle hours, the sentry's relief comes up the small flight of brick stairs from inside the tower, climbs out onto the platform, and takes the watch. The two men exchange almost no words. The new sentry has come up wearing his coat. He has a cup of warm tea in one hand. He hands it to the man going off shift. The man going off shift drinks half of it standing there, hands it back, nods, and goes down the stairs to his bedroll. The new sentry sips the rest of the tea slowly, his back against the low wall, his eyes on the country to the north. The moon climbs higher. It has cleared the ridge to the east now, and hangs free in the deep blue sky. Large and silver and patient, the wall in this light has gone from a dark line to a faint silver line. The stones which had looked black an hour ago now look pale grey. The watchtowers along the ridge stand at their regular intervals, small dim square shapes, each one with a thin curl of smoke rising from its interior brazier into the cold air. The frost on the grass at the foot of the wall has thickened. It is the kind of frost that catches the moonlight and holds it. From a high enough vantage, the long line of grass at the base of the wall must look, tonight, like a river of pale silver running for miles in both directions along the foot of the stones. A wolf calls somewhere on the country to the north, one long note that holds for several seconds and then trails off. The sentry hears it. He is not concerned. He has heard 1,000 of these calls over the years. He listens to see if a second wolf will answer. None does. The country goes quiet again. Inside the room below, the soldiers are deep in sleep. One of them has rolled onto his side, his arm under his cheek. Another has thrown off his coat in the warmth of the brazier and is breathing through his mouth. The soldier with the wooden flute is curled around his cloth-wrapped bundle of it, as though it were a small animal he was protecting. None of them are dreaming anything important. They are just sleeping the long, deep sleep of men whose bodies have been doing physical work in cold air all day. The brazier dims further. A small piece of charcoal collapses in on itself, throwing up a faint shower of orange sparks, and then settling into a duller red glow. The shadows on the low arched ceiling lengthen and soften. The room is no longer warm. It is no longer cold either. It is simply the room. The men inside it sleep on. Outside, the country is wide and empty. The Mongol scouting party from the early evening, whatever it was, has long since melted back into the grass and the dark to the north. The trade horses from the morning's market have been led hours ago down the southern road to their new stables. The merchant with the salt voucher in his coat is asleep at an inn 3 days' ride to the south. The kiln yard is cold. The iron pot beside it is empty and clean. Everything that was happening in this small piece of the world earlier this evening has now come to a stop. The wall holds. Nothing moves. The sentry on his platform finishes his cup of tea. He sets the empty cup down on the brick beside him. He folds his arms across his chest. He looks at the moon. The moon looks back in the patient way that the moon looks at everything. He thinks of nothing. He just watches. Time passes. The moon moves a hand's breadth across the sky. The frost spreads a little further. The wolf does not call again. Somewhere far down the line, on a tower a great distance to the east, another sentry is doing the same shift and is also watching the same moon and is also folded into the same coat against the same cold. He is not aware of our sentry, and our sentry is not aware of him, but they are doing the same work, in the same hour, on the same long line of stone. The wall connects them. The wall is what connects everyone tonight. The bricklayer who set the brick 5 springs ago, the foreman who stamped it, the kiln master who fired it, the conscript who scratched his line into the underside, the merchant who carried the millet, the clerk who issued the voucher, the soldier asleep on the bedroll, the sentry on the platform, the boy in the village, the old woman on the stool, the wolf in the grass, the moon over all of it. All of them are held tonight by the same long, careful line of stone. Hours later, when the night is at its deepest, and the moon has begun its slow descent toward the western ridge, the second relief comes up the stairs. The sentry hands over the watch. He goes down to his bedroll. He sleeps almost as soon as he lies down. Above him, on the platform, a third sentry settles in for the last watch of the night, the one that will hold the tower until first light. The wall, all along its ridges, continues. Tower to tower, the rhythm holds. Sentry to sentry, the watch passes. Soldier to soldier, the sleep deepens. Brick to brick, the line stands. The country to the north is quiet. The country to the south is quiet. The river of stone runs through the moonlight along the spine of the mountains, slow and silver and unbroken for as far as the eye can see. The brazier dims to embers. The kettle is silent. The wind is still. The moon is high. The wall stands. And so the wall slept too, and the long, slow hours of the night moved over it without sound. We are almost at the end of the night, and the wall is still there. We began the evening at a kiln yard, with a boy turning bricks in the sun. We watched a foreman press a small wooden stamp into wet clay, leaving a kiln name and a weight and a quiet signature that we would find again centuries later on the underside of a brick at Jinko. We watched a bricklayer set a brick into the wall with a trowel and a tap, and we watched the brick disappear into the structure forever. We stood by an iron pot of pale rice soup beside a lime kiln, and we watched two men stir it with long wooden paddles in the late afternoon light. We learned very slowly why those Ming joints have lasted 500 years. We followed a cart of millet sacks across half a country. We met a clerk with a brush and a red seal who handed a tired merchant a small slip of paper worth, in the world he was about to walk back into, a great deal of salt. We sat at a brazier inside a hollow watchtower and watched a soldier shave a curl of dark tea from a brick into a clay cup. We climbed onto the roof of a watchtower at dusk and learned to read the language of smoke. 1 column for a small thing, 2 columns for a larger thing, 3 for something serious. We watched the line of conversation move from tower to tower along the ridge, faster than any horse could carry it, slower than any modern message. We walked down to a small market gate in the wall, where horses changed hands in the cold of a frontier dawn for tea bricks and bolts of silk and a careful pinch of salt. We met the same wall again, in this different mood, not a barrier, but a careful membrane, with quiet doors at intervals. We stood in a garrison village on the south slope as the lamps were lit one by one, and the wall above the rooftops held the last grey light of the day. We watched a woman grind millet to flour on a stone mill. We watched a child lead a goat into a new pen, and an old man walk a line between rows of vegetables he had walked all his life. And then we watched the night come up the slope, slowly from the bottom, and gather around the small houses, and climb the wall, and quiet the watchtowers, and pull in the cold grass at the foot of the stones. There is no more for us to do here. The brick is in place, the mortar has set, the cart has gone home, the salt voucher is folded against a merchant's ribs somewhere far away, the smoke has thinned, the market gate is closed for the night, the lamps in the village have gone out. The soldier on the bedroll is breathing in long, slow rhythms in the warm, small room of a hollow tower built by a general who has been dead 400 years. The moon is high, the wall is silver, the country is wide and quiet. Nothing comes from the north, nothing comes from the south. There is nothing more you need to hold on to tonight. Let the kiln go cold, let the cart roll home, let the small bright pieces of what you learned this evening sit in their own quiet place in your mind, where they will be there in the morning if you want them. For now, just rest. Let the wall hold its long line for you. Let the watchtowers stand. Let the moon move. Close your eyes if they are not closed already. Let your breath grow slow. Let the room around you grow soft. Let the small lamp in your mind go out. The wall is there. It will be there in the morning. Sleep well.